Someone in your group is gone. The body is still warm. There is no hospital to call, no funeral home, no priest with a pre-written prayer. There is only you, the fire, and the silence where that person used to be. What do you do next? For most of human history, this was the question. Not a hypothetical, not a thought experiment, a real, immediate, terrifying problem that every human group faced over and over for roughly 300,000 years. And what they did, what your ancestors did, was far stranger, far more tender, and far more deliberate than you have probably been told. Death did not start meaning something to humans recently. It started meaning something almost incomprehensibly long ago. In 2015, a team led by paleoanthropologist Lee Berger announced the discovery of hundreds of bones in a remote chamber deep inside the Rising Star Cave system in South Africa. The species they found was Homo naledi, a creature with a brain roughly one-third the size of yours. Small, ancient, and yet the bones were deposited deliberately. There were no signs of predator activity, no flooding to explain the accumulation. The leading hypothesis is that Homo naledi was intentionally placing its dead in that dark, unreachable chamber long before modern humans even existed as a species. Your ancestors were not the first to feel something when someone died. Something much older than you was already feeling it. But your direct ancestors, Homo sapiens, took that instinct and built something extraordinary around it. The oldest known intentional burial site attributed to modern humans was discovered at Qafzeh Cave in Israel. The graves there date back roughly 100,000 years. Inside them, researchers found something that stops you cold. A child, buried with the antlers of a large deer, placed deliberately across the body. Not dropped, placed. Someone chose those antlers. Someone positioned them. Someone was making a statement about what this child had been or where this child was going. That is not an animal discarding a corpse. That is a mind grappling with the concept of loss. So let us reconstruct what actually happened. Let us go back roughly 40,000 to 70,000 years into a world of small mobile bands of hunter-gatherers. Groups of perhaps 25 to 50 people, living across the grasslands and forests and coastlines of a planet that would be barely recognizable to you today. Someone dies. Maybe it is an elder. Maybe it is a young hunter killed by an animal. Maybe it is a mother who did not survive childbirth. The group does not move on immediately. This is important. Anthropologist Christopher Boehm, whose decades of research into hunter-gatherer social behavior is documented in his book Hierarchy in the Forest, found consistent evidence across dozens of studied groups that death triggers a period of collective pause. Movement stops. Foraging halts. The group gathers. The body is attended to quickly. In a warm climate, decomposition begins within hours, so there is urgency. But the urgency does not mean carelessness. Bodies were arranged, knees drawn up, hands near the face, the body curled into something that looks unmistakably like sleep. At Sunghir, a site in Russia dated to about 34,000 years ago, two adolescents were found buried head to head. Their bodies were covered in more than 10,000 mammoth ivory beads, each one requiring hours of labor to carve and drill. The beads had been sewn into clothing that no longer exists. The clothing itself has rotted away over the millennia, but the beads remain scattered in the outline of what the garments once covered. Someone dressed these children for wherever they were going. Someone spent weeks, possibly months, of their life making the beads that would go into the ground and never be seen again. Think about what that means. In a world where every hour of effort had to be justified by survival, people chose to pour enormous resources into honoring the dead. Grief, it turns out, is not a luxury. It is ancient. It is structural. The ochre comes next. Red ochre, iron oxide ground into a powder, appears at burial sites across Africa, Europe, and the Middle East, spanning tens of thousands of years. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, evidence of ochre processing dates back at least 100,000 years. Researchers including Francesco De Rico have analyzed the ochre kits found there: grinding stones, ochre pieces, abalone shells used as containers. and concluded that the pigment was being produced with intentional, repeatable techniques. Ochre was painted on bodies before burial across countless cultures with no contact with one another. Red, the color of blood, the color of life, marked on the body at the moment life departed. Your ancestors were communicating something. To the dead, to each other, to whatever came next. Then there were the objects. Food placed near the body. Tools. Flowers, possibly. Pollen found at the Qafzeh Cave burials in Iraq, dated to around 60,000 years ago and associated with Neanderthals, suggested to archaeologist Ralph Solecki that bunches of flowering plants may have been laid with the dead, though this remains debated. But across anatomically modern human burials, the pattern is clear. Things were given. Things that still worked. Things that still had value. A spear placed beside a hunter. A grinding stone beside a woman. Objects chosen to mean something. This is the counterintuitive truth that archaeology forces you to confront. Your ancestors did not give up useful things lightly. Resources were scarce. Starvation was always possible, and yet they gave their best tools, their best ornaments, their most painstaking artwork to people who could no longer use them. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner, whose long-term fieldwork with the Yuhuansi-san people of the Kalahari produced landmark research on social bonding and reciprocity, documented the centrality of grief rituals to community cohesion. The giving was not waste. The giving was the point. It told every living person watching, you matter enough that when you die, everything you owned will go with you. When your time comes, we will not forget you either. That promise held the group together. After the burial, the group grieved aloud. Mourning was communal and physical. Keening, a high, sustained vocal sound of grief, appears across human cultures so ancient and so geographically spread that researchers believe it predates recorded history. People wept together. They held each other. In many studied hunter-gatherer cultures, the name of the dead person is not spoken for a period of time after the death. Not because the person is forgotten, but because language itself is treated as too small to contain what was lost. Silence as respect. Silence as grief made structural. Then, in many cultures, the group moved. Not just physically, emotionally. The place where someone had died was treated with caution, sometimes avoided entirely. The spirit of the dead was understood to linger, not as superstition for its own sake, but as a natural extension of a brain that had spent years predicting where that person would be, what they would say, what they would do next. Grief, neuroscientists now understand, is in part a prediction error. Your brain expected that person to be there. They are not. The error fires again and again. In a world without the conceptual framework to understand that biological process, it would have felt exactly like a presence. A ghost is what a grieving brain produces when it has no other explanation. And so the rituals emerged to manage the transition, to help the living brain slowly, carefully update its model of the world. The burial was not just for the dead, it was for the living. Every action, the positioning of the body, the beads, the ochre, the food, the gathering of the whole group was a way of saying, this is real. This has happened. We acknowledge it together, and we will carry it forward together. Here is what the archaeologists do not always say plainly enough. What your ancestors were doing around their dead was not primitive. It was not superstition in its infancy. It was one of the most sophisticated social technologies ever developed. The ritual management of death is what allowed small bands of grieving humans to remain functional units. It is what allowed knowledge, story, and identity to survive the loss of the people who carried them. Without it, the group fractures. With it, the group endures. The Sunghir children, buried in their thousands of mammoth ivory beads, are roughly 34,000 years old. But the tradition they represent goes back much further. And it did not end. Every culture that has ever existed on Earth has buried its dead with intention. Everyone. No exceptions. The specific forms differ wildly. Sky burials, cremation, elaborate tombs, simple cairns, trees, rivers, fire, but the intention is always there. The acknowledgement that this person was here and now is gone. And that fact must be marked. You still feel this. You still do this. When someone you love dies, you gather. You bring food. You tell stories. You choose what to bury with them or what to scatter or what to keep. You cry together in a room and feel somehow slightly less alone in the enormity of it. That is not modern. That is not cultural. That is 300,000 years old at least. You learned it from someone who learned it from someone who learned it from someone, all the way back to a dark chamber in South Africa where a small-brained creature with a big heart left its dead somewhere safe, in the dark, and walked back out into the world. Someone in your group is gone. You know exactly what to do. Your ancestors taught you.